right, welcome to the Unprofessionals podcast. My name is Joshua Sutter, and I am joined once again by Grant Hughes, the NBA national featured columnist at Bleacher Report. You can find him on Twitter at GT_Hughes. He just wrote a good piece yesterday about 5 things to watch in the Warriors Thunder series. And Grant, I appreciate you joining me again, man.
Hey, I enjoyed it last time. Thanks for having me back.
Of course. So before we get into some of the details on the playoffs, how has this Warriors experience been, just in terms of, because I know you've been at some of the games, but overall, not necessarily their play, just how has the actual experience been?
You know, it's been weird, I guess is the best way that I could put it. Because, you know, with obviously the biggest storyline for their postseason was sort of the worst case scenario happened in that Curry got hurt. And then he got hurt again. And sort of really to me, that way that this whole run was ever going to go bad is if they lost him for a significant period of time. So I think, you know, the team never let on that it was concerned outwardly, but obviously, you know, they're all logical human beings that had to have had that thought themselves that losing Curry was basically like a fatal thing. But they survived it, and it had a lot to do with the opposition they had to play while Curry was out. But I think that, to me, you know, felt like a brush with death. I feel like we're getting way too hyperbolic already, but, you know, that was what it felt like. And to have gotten through that, or at least the worst of it now, I feel like, you know, there's a weird sort of like weight lifted off this team that I think potentially could help them really hit that gear that they hit a few times this year where they look just totally unbeatable.
No, definitely. That makes a lot of sense. Has the home court like advantage been there for the Warriors as much this year? I know in the past NBA teams that have won a title like that first year, it's crazy. The fans you can almost like taste that they're thirsty for it. Have the fans been as wild and crazy this year and given the Warriors that much of an advantage like they did last year?
Yes and no. That's a great question because it has been different. I think to me, what the sort of prevailing feeling from the crowd that I get being there this time around is that there's like trepidation when things aren't going right. There's more like I think the crowd very much understands the expectations and the stakes. Like basically what I mean is they realize that this is a team that is expected to win a title. And they realize that basically what you're dealing with is if you win, you've met expectations. If you don't, you're disappointing. And I feel like that weighs on the fans a little bit. So what you hear is like a real anxiety if it's possible for 19,000 people to be anxious at the same time. But when they have fallen down early in games, which has happened pretty frequently, there's an anxiety and there's a nervousness that you can really feel when you're there. And that wasn't there as much last season. I think that's a new thing that it comes with being defending champ. So it is different. That's for sure.
So it's just you and me here. Let's be honest. How scared were you after game 3 when the Blazers won? We weren't sure when Curry was coming back. And there was a real sense that the Blazers, even though they had lost the first 2 games, that they were competing. And now game 4 is in Portland. The crowd's going crazy. Lillard could go off and actually, you know, really hurt them. And the Warriors don't have the trump card of Steph. So just being honest, in your gut, were you a little scared?
Oh, yeah. I don't think I was ever concerned that the Warriors, I didn't think they were going to lose the series. I just didn't, regardless of what happened with Curry. But you could see that Portland was really taking advantage of a lot of the lapses that the Warriors had. And this has been a problem all year, that Golden State sort of kind of messes around and then puts on a 6-minute surge where they just blow it open. That's kind of their MO this season. But you could see the Blazers really building leads and capitalizing in those sort of lulls. And I, like you mentioned, you know, Lillard looked like he was going to be continuing, you know, consistent. He was going to score, and they couldn't really handle McCollum. And really the key to me was the peripheral guys like Al-Farouq Aminu, Mo Harkless, even, you know, Alan Crabb. they were making shots. And I thought that they were playing a little over their heads. So that kind of mitigated some of the concerns, because I thought the Blazers would come back to earth a little bit. Turns out they really didn't. The Warriors had to elevate their play. But there was some concern, but I kind of thought that, everybody would sort of regress to the mean a little bit, and that the Warriors would win it.
Which of course ended up happening. And you wrote a piece talking about the ceiling is high despite the series loss to the Warriors for the Blazers. And I think if you had told any Blazers fan in the previous summer after losing Aldridge and multiple players that they would be in a semifinal match or a quarterfinal matchup against the Warriors in the playoffs, and that they would actually win a game, I think they would definitely think it's a success. So just real quick, tell Blazers fans why the future is bright despite only really having one superstar and then like a really good player in McCollum.
Yeah, well, I mean, that's the start of it. You've got two guys that I think we've now seen that you can make those the focal points of your team, and they work well together. Defensively, you'll always have issues with Lillard and McCollum, but in terms of your offense is set. You have those two guys, and you put decent 3-point shooters around them, and you're going to have a top 10 offense at worst, I think, going forward. But just more broadly, as you alluded to, I think if you're a Blazers fan, you should be ecstatic that your team is basically like 2 or 3 years ahead of any realistic schedule that you could have set out last summer. They made the playoffs. Nobody thought, you couldn't find a prediction that had them with more than like 34 wins, I don't think. And I feel like this is sustainable based on what we've seen. I think we should expect them to be a playoff team again. They have a ton of cap space. They can get out there and kind of look for some pieces to get better on the margins. But I would be over the moon if I were a Blazers fan about, how consistently competitive this team, I think, can be going forward. I feel like, if they get to the second round and lose again next year, that's going to feel like, the progress has stagnated, but there's not that many teams that make it that far. And I think we should expect the Blazers to be very good again. I don't think this is a fluke. And that's probably the most positive thing about this season.
Yeah, definitely a very bright future. And at the very least, because unless, they make a variety of moves, they're not going to be a team that's favored to potentially win a championship next year. But honestly, just like what a fun, next couple of years this is going to be for Blazers fans, because they probably really thought it was over this summer, and now they have a budding superstar in Lillard who can go off and just make any game incredibly fun, kind of like Curry does to a lesser extent. You have McCollum, who kind of came out of nowhere, and obviously he was kind of good last year, but just got more playing time this year. And so at the very least, it's going to be a really fun team to root for, well coached. So definitely a bright future for the Warriors. Moving on to Steph Curry, the beloved Stephen Curry. Since we last talked, he was announced to be the unanimous MVP. However, there were a few blabbermouths who argued that LeBron is more valuable, and I say blabbermouths, lightly. They made good points, but there were a few people who argued that LeBron is more valuable to the Cavs than Curry is to the Warriors, and I kind of get where they're coming from with that, because the surrounding cast for the Warriors, you could argue, is much better for the Cavs. But is that even a viable conversation to be having?
Well, I think that's the only way that you can have it, is if you sort of get into, it depends on what you think the definition of is, or if you get into the semantic stuff, what does valuable mean? How do we measure value? You can sort of make any case you want. And I get it. I think we probably agree that Curry should have been unanimous. I'm surprised it happened. I didn't think it would, but he should have been. But, you can sort of make the argument that LeBron is more valuable depending on how you frame it. To me, the difference is, maybe the Cavs are maybe they're not even a playoff team without LeBron. I don't know. It's hard to say. You can't prove a negative. And they're very, very good with him. To me, the difference is, and this is kind of the case I would have made for Curry as most improved, he takes a team that is already excellent and makes it historically great. And in the same sense, he went from being excellent to being historically great individually. That's a bigger leap to me. That's the harder thing to do. I would argue, too, that that's a more valuable thing, because if the point is to win a title, having a guy that can elevate you to heights really nobody's ever seen, that's valuable. And I'd say that's most valuable. So I get the sort of nitpicking, but I don't think there's a case to be made that anyone was better than Curry this year by like any reasonable metric.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you about the unanimous MVP thing. It's kind of hard to not reward a dude who just led a team to 73 wins, a record that was inconceivable to ever be broken. And then I remember as we did our podcast last month, it was right after that they lost to the Spurs, and then they lost another game, and it seemed like it wasn't going to happen, and it was just between Curry and Draymond. Those guys just. It's one of those things where they just kept refusing to let them lose in games that they could have laid down in. And you talked about Curry in the most improved player conversation. In one of your pieces, you talked about the PER increase. And I mean, his player efficiency rating went up 3.5 from one MVP year to another. It's just almost, it's hard to comprehend. Do you think we're really understanding and really just being able to properly evaluate how insane Stephen Curry's year was?
I think, it's hard. It's crazy to say like we're not giving Steph Curry enough credit because he's the darling of the league. He's all anyone talks about. Everyone agrees. I think not everyone, almost everyone agrees he's the best player in the league. But to me, like it's bigger than that. It's not just like you mentioned the PER increase. He had the biggest scoring increase for an MVP. He went 50, 40, 90 again, but he took like twice as many threes as anyone else that's ever been in that group. And there's only like 8 other guys that have done it. But to me, the difference is, and we'll appreciate this eventually, he is fundamentally changing the way the game is played. And he's fundamentally changing the way defenses scheme. And he's fundamentally changing the way you can sort of attack offensively just with his range and his ball handling, the combination of which we've never, ever seen before. It's just, period. No one has ever played like he does. And it may be the case that no one else ever will, or it will be a very long time before we see someone do the things he does. But I think, you could count on one hand, I think, the number of guys that have altered the landscape of the sport and changed the way that the game is actually played. And it's like Wilt, Magic Johnson, even Shaq to some extent. I don't know. It's hard to know where to cut that off. But that to me is what sets him apart this season, is that he has done something that very, very few players have ever done. And I think eventually we'll appreciate that.
One of the, I don't want to say good aspects to Steph being out, but one of the things that I've taken away from it is we all knew Klay Thompson was a really good player. Like he's one of the best shooters of all time already. He can be a really good defensive player when he wants to be. And throughout the year, he's improved different aspects of his game, such as, the post game and all that. But it's coming to the point where I'm really starting to, Draymond and Curry get most of the credit. And I think, people do appreciate Klay. But Klay is really starting to actually look like a legitimate, like, superstar in the NBA. And on both ends, like, at least one of the best offensive and defensive combination players in the NBA. Like, I don't know if there's many two-way players who are more efficient and more talented than Klay Thompson is.
I agree. I think, like I mentioned, you can't tell how good the Cavaliers would be without LeBron unless he just wasn't there, and it's hard to test for that. We sort of got a test of, I think the perception was that, and to some extent it's still true, that Thompson really benefits from all the attention Curry gets and the space, and you can't, devote the resources you should to a shooter like Thompson when there's a better shooter that always has the ball on his team. But with Curry out, Thompson was terrific. And I think, we'll look at the scoring, but as you mentioned, the defense was huge. Damian Lillard is one of the hardest guys to guard in the league, and let alone for a 6'7" shooting guard to try to chase him around. And Thompson was phenomenal in making him work in that last series. And to me, maybe you say, well, Portland isn't a good defensive team and neither are the Rockets, so we still don't know. And maybe that's partly true, I think. But I think it's to the point now where you could say that if Thompson was your best offensive player and he was the guy you built your offense around, you have a pretty good offense. And I'm not sure we could have been certain about that before this postseason. So for sure, yeah, he's really excelled, and I think changed the way people think about him. I don't think you can say he's just a complimentary guy anymore. I think he's a legitimate star that might actually be the best player at his position.
So moving on to the OKC Thunder, I don't want to say it was a legendary series because there weren't, it didn't go to 7 games and there weren't a lot of crazy moments. But in terms of just coaching and overall play, it was really a fantastic series between the Thunder and the Spurs. I think we saw, little Billy Donovan grow up right before our eyes in terms of there were moments where you felt like he somehow had the weird coaching advantage over Popovich, which I haven't felt in a long time. But what impressed you about them against the Spurs?
Well, I hate to kind of go down this road first, but as you mentioned, I think Donovan did outcoach Popovich, and you have to throw the caveat out there that we're never going to know, all of the intricacies that happened in the huddle in the locker room, and Popovich knows more about basketball than you or I will ever know about anything combined. But Donovan, he went big. And he had Cantor in there with Steven Adams fairly often, or relatively often, which they didn't do a ton during the regular season, especially with Durant on the floor. And that worked. I mean, they dominated on the boards, and they were able to really stop the Spurs from scoring, which I think if you were watching the Spurs closely this year against good teams, you could foresee the inability to score kind of laying there dormant, and then it really came out in that series. But Popovich, I thought, should have gone small sooner. Somebody asked him about that in the post game, and he really kind of jumped down the reporter's throat in true Popovichian fashion. I was really stunned that it got as ugly as it did as quickly as it did. But the Thunder really exploited the Spurs' stagnant offense, and the Spurs did not attack a pretty suspect Thunder defense with as much ball movement and player movement as they should have. And Popovich just didn't adjust, and it may have been a personnel thing, but I think the Thunder, kind of dominated in a lot of ways, including in the coaching category, which you never would have suspected going in.
So the thing, and I was trying to think about this before, and you bring up a good point about the ball movement, but I was trying to think what disappointed me about the Spurs in the series. And it was an odd case of, besides the perhaps the lack of ball movement in the last few games, I don't know if I was sincerely disappointed in the way that they played in the series. It genuinely felt like the Thunder all of a sudden turned into a better team top to bottom than the Spurs, and they figured stuff out. So was there anything that really disappointed you greatly about how the Spurs played?
I guess I think, I'm kind of with you, actually. It felt like they were overmatched, and it's hard to be disappointed when, that's the case. I think, to me, I guess what I'm disappointed in is they didn't try to get smaller sooner and more often, because it was very clear that attacking the Thunder in one-on-one isolation stuff and high post stuff for LaMarcus Aldridge just wasn't going to work, because the Thunder have a bunch of really athletic, good one-on-one defenders. And I think it would have been better for the Spurs if they would have forced the Thunder to move more and communicate, because that's where they fall apart defensively. And going smaller, I think, would have done that. But to say I'm disappointed in that would sort of mean that I have to criticize Popovich more, and I'm just not comfortable doing that, I guess, because I have so much respect for him.
I'm glad you mentioned the aspect of the Spurs playing small, because I think that was brought up a lot, fairly so. But I was trying to think how they could have gone small efficiently. I mean, I guess it's Aldridge at the 5, Kawhi at the 4, Danny Green at the 3, and then a mixture of Ginobili, Patty Mills, and Parker. But so you think that lineup could have properly, and whether the Thunder responded and went small or stayed big, it still just kind of felt like with the way that Cantor and Adams were playing, and even Ibaka in the last game, that it still felt like even if the Spurs had gone small, it felt like that they were playing well, and the Thunder just kind of figured the entire team out, matchup to matchup.
Yeah, I mean, it may be the case that there wasn't an adjustment that was going to swing this series. I think it's totally possible that what you're saying is right, in conjunction with the fact that some of the Spurs old guys just sort of got older in a hurry. Duncan, I thought, looked as bad as he's ever looked for in stretches of this series, just in terms of his mobility and the struggles he had finishing on the inside. Tony Parker is not someone who just blows by people anymore. And really, if you're looking for the root of the stagnant offense in San Antonio and the reason that they, consciously decided to isolate Aldridge and isolate Leonard more, that's it. Because that offense used to start with Parker beating someone, whether in a pick and roll or individually, and that got the ball movement going. If saying go small, that'll fix it, maybe not. I think, like you said, the Thunder just athletically were dominant, and they didn't really, the Spurs just couldn't get anything going against a defense that didn't have a reputation for playing all that well this year. I think they were 12th in the league in efficiency, but found something that worked and really stuck to it and rode it to a dominant series win.
The Duncan thing was, it was so weird because usually a player of his age, and even a player who has had a career that matches up to perhaps his level, I've never felt the way I did watching how this series unfolded. It's like, no matter how bad he looked, you just assumed that he was like maybe hurt, or if Pop wasn't playing him like he was, in the first few games before the last game when he got a lot of PT. But you were still just kind of thinking, oh, it's a tactical thing. Like Duncan's fine, because time and time again over the last 8 years, we've kind of counted the Spurs team out, and in the last few years, we've started thinking, Duncan has reached the peak, and yet somehow even this year to a little bit of a lesser extent, but in years past, he's been an unbelievable defensive tactician as far as operating in the paint and managing his team. And then on offense, he can still do somewhat Tim Duncan things. But it was weird seeing this old guy playing basketball and still thinking no, he's going to be fine. He's going to be able to come back the next game and he's going to put up, 20 and 10, and he's going to be great on defense, and he's going to be the reason the Spurs win. And it's still kind of unbelievable that he just ran out of gas, and I've never seen that happen to Tim Duncan. And it obviously leads to the question of is he done? Is he done? Is he done? But it was weird watching him go down like that, wasn't it?
Yeah. And, this series really highlighted it. This is kind of a nightmare matchup for him because, Cantor is just relentless on the boards. Adams is 22 years old and really strong and moves really well for a guy that size. Serge Ibaka is an athletic big guy. And then you've got Durant and Westbrook running around, and, so Duncan looks even slower and less athletic than he otherwise would against that sort of backdrop. But this was kind of happening all year. The defensive stuff, a lot of the advanced metrics early in the year still had Duncan as the Spurs' best defender, even better than Kawhi. That kind of, tapered off as the season went on. But what also happened is, the situations in which he was capable of playing diminished. And there were more and more matchups that just weren't any good for Duncan to be out there, especially as the league got smaller. And as he was involved in trying to defend out on the perimeter more, if there were pick and rolls and that sort of thing, it happened gradually. This wasn't an overnight thing. It just really felt like it came to a head because they needed him in this series, and because relative to the competition, he just couldn't compete athletically. So it was striking how it sort of ended. I agree, and it was bizarre to sort of feel like, oh, this is what it looks like when it happens,
And the weird thing is that's usually how it ends with athletes, right? Is all of a sudden you're watching, and all of a sudden they look a step or two off and they look a step or two slower. And I guess with Duncan, it happened in such a gradual, slow way that none of us really noticed until he wasn't able to compensate with his brain anymore. And it was a clear athletic difference. So enough about Tim Duncan. We'll have time to chat about him. Should he retire or whatever. But I think before this series, before the Spurs Thunder series, Warriors fans would have said that the Spurs scared them more. After, Would the Spurs still scare you more, or with the new way that the Thunder seem to figure out their lineup finally, are they the scarier team?
Well, first of all, I think, the Spurs have loomed for as long as the Warriors have sort of been this team at this level as like the biggest threat. But after the regular season, I think if you just sat there and looked at it, the Warriors took 3 out of 4 against San Antonio. I think it's 3 out of 4, and handily won a fast-paced game, won when they slowed it down. And it was very clear that the Spurs were not going to be able to score against Golden State. And as it turned out, they couldn't score against the Thunder either. The flip side is the Warriors went 3-0 against the Thunder, but the Thunder were tied or ahead in the fourth quarter of all 3 of those games. And in one of them, Curry had to make 12 threes and a game winner to win. In another, they had like a 12-4 run to finish out and overcome a fourth quarter deficit. And in the third one, I don't remember specifically, but the Thunder were ahead in the fourth. So, unless, you could still be worried about the Spurs because they're the Spurs, but logically, the Thunder really were the bigger threat. And the Thunder really did play the Warriors much, much better than San Antonio did. So, as surprising as the result is, I thought the Spurs would beat the Thunder, and I didn't think it was going to be all that close. The Thunder that now stand there sort of in the Warriors' way, if you want to view it that way, probably really are the most formidable team that Golden State could have wound up playing. Certainly scarier than the Spurs based on how the regular season went.
The Thunder resurgence in terms of like getting back to a peak level of playing has had a lot to do with obviously Adams and Cantor playing together, and Cantor really picking. I mean, he's always been like a really good offensive post player, but his advantageous height and his athleticism on the boards has really placed him seemingly like above Ibaka in terms of crunch time minutes. And I think part of that has to do with the fact that Ibaka just has kind of been. It almost reminds me of how Chris Bosh was in the first couple of years of the LeBron era, where he was just shooting threes and it felt weird. And I know Serge he comes inside a little more than Bosh did, but it still feels like he isn't himself. So what would be more hurtful to the Warriors scheme is that Ibaka getting back to his old self, quote unquote, and playing in the post as a 5 and the Thunder playing small? Or is it the Thunder sticking with Adams and Cantor, and unless Bogut, plays one of his best series of his life, then it seems like it would be a bigger, better version of what Cleveland tried to do last year in the finals. And Cleveland did succeed a little bit, but what's scarier to you, the Thunder going small with Ibaka at the 5, or Adams and Cantor dominating on the boards? I think they went, like plus 30 in a game against the Warriors. It was the game that I think Curry hit the 30-footer or whatever it was to win. But if the Thunder can dominate the boards like that, I mean, that has to be some kind of massive advantage equal to a Steph Curry. Obviously, it was, because the game was tied to a Steph Curry 12 3-pointer kind of game.
Yeah, to me, the Cantor question and how the Thunder utilize him with Adams is kind of the pivotal issue of the series right now, other than the health of the Warriors, key guys. And so to me, in answer to your question, I think that if the Thunder were to go small and play Ibaka at the 5, the Warriors would be slipping on the floor because they'd be drooling so much. I think the Warriors would love for the Thunder to try to go small and have Ibaka, try to post up Green or try to defend somebody in space, or I just think if you try to go small against Golden State, you're done, because nobody does small better than they do. And to me, the better way to attack them is with bigger lineups that, as you mentioned, are gonna, give away a lot, because a Cantor Adams front line, just in terms of their ability to get up and down the floor, even let alone defend pick and rolls, it's going to be brutally difficult for them to compete. But I think you can make the case that they'll make up for that on the offensive glass and creating second chance opportunities and making sure the Warriors don't get second shots and dominating on the boards and making it tough to finish inside just with their size. So really the Cantor Adams lineup is one that is it's deeply flawed, and I think the Warriors can exploit it, but it might also be the best chance for the Thunder to win, if that makes any sense. It's just sort of a who's going to blink thing, and that's what I wrote about it. I don't know how that's going to play out. I think it's going to be really interesting to see sort of, do the Warriors say, okay, we can't handle this size, we got to go bigger, or do the Thunder say, well, this isn't going to work, they're running us off the floor, we got to put one of these guys on the bench. I don't know how it'll go, but I think that's really critical in how this series plays out.
If the Thunder do decide to go big, are you confident in Bogut and Ezeli's ability to not only keep up with them on the actual, like on the rebounding side of things, but are you confident that they can keep up to them in terms of the pace and the defensive side of the ball?
Well, I mean, one thing, I don't think there's any scenario we'll ever see Bogut and Ezeli out there together. I don't think that's what you meant, but I think that'll be the last thing the Warriors would ever try. I think Ezeli athletically, yeah. I don't think athletically he's at a disadvantage against either of those guys. I think really, if the Warriors get a good Ezeli series, quote unquote, I mean, that changes a lot, and you never know when that's going to happen. He was up and down. He had some nice stretches against Portland, but he was rough against Houston and barely played. So Ezeli can handle it. Bogut is someone, we see it more and more, and it tends to happen in the playoffs where he's not quick up and down the floor. He has these nights where you can tell he just isn't able to move, and it's hard to know when those are coming. Some nights he's great, and as a offensive fulcrum, like he really matters, and he'll have 5 blocks and he'll grab every rebound, but that just doesn't happen every night anymore. And if you get a bad Bogut night, those two guys are going to it'll be rough to watch, frankly. So really it's going to come down to a third guy, and that's Draymond Green. And how is he going to compete on the boards, and how is he going to run past these guys in transition? Because it's hard for me to see Bogut keeping up consistently. He might have a great game, but as far as the series goes, I think Ezeli and Green might play, significantly bigger roles.
Is Steph Curry healthy? And I think, most people would say, oh, sure he is. He had an unbelievable overtime game, and so the highlights would say, sure, he's fine. But I guess the eyeball test is that it seemed like he was just getting, warmed up in a couple of those games in terms of, if you haven't played basketball for that long, I'm saying this from my ravenous pickup experience, that you have to get back into the flow of things before you actually kind of feel like yourself a little bit. And Steph Curry feeling like himself is, going for 17 in overtime. But I think he went for 17 in overtime. Is that right?
That's right. NBA record.
Yeah. So he comes back from injury, gets himself warmed up for 4 quarters and then goes insane in the overtime. But do you think that he's fully himself and that he feels comfortable on that knee?
No, he said he's not 100%. And I think the Warriors' expectation is that he won't be until he has, a few weeks off of just doing nothing in the summer to really fully get back. With that said, I think you're right. I think he was, kind of feeling things out and, erupted late in the games when they needed it in games 4 and 5. But if as it's silly to pick plays like this apart, but those shots he hit in game 5 to close it out, there was one over Ed Davis. There was one over Aminu where he was kind of yo-yoing the ball at the top of the arc and went behind the back a couple times and created like no separation at all, which for him may not matter because he can just get his shot off. But, those are really, really tough shots anyway, but they were even tougher to me because he didn't quite have the lateral quickness that he normally does to create that space. So maybe it just means he's going to make a bunch of harder shots. Like at this point, we shouldn't rule that out as a sustainable option. Like if anyone's going to do that, he could just do that. But I think your instincts are right. I think he's not quite right, and he may never be right. That doesn't mean he won't be terrific, but there's something different. There's no question about that.
What's the biggest weakness for the Warriors? I guess it could be the fact that, like you just said, their best player may not be right, fully. And, his 80% is still better than most people in the entire league. But what's the biggest weakness you see for both teams?
The biggest weakness to me for the Thunder first, just because it comes right to mind, is, defensively, I don't think they're going to have anything close to the same success they had against the Spurs. And that's because the Warriors are about as different on offense from San Antonio as you can be. They move the ball like crazy. They stretch the floor. They run. They push the pace, and they force a defense to operate collectively. The way they run the pick and roll, it takes like all 5 guys defensively to cover the gaps and to stop the penetration and to figure out what to do when Draymond has the ball going downhill. And they got to communicate and move and help the helper. And the Thunder just aren't any good at that. I mean, they're okay, but at this stage of the game, they're not good enough, I think, to consistently stop the Warriors. So that to me is the Thunder's biggest potential issue. For the Warriors, their biggest weakness is they don't have anyone that has consistently stopped Kevin Durant. I mean, he lit them up every game this year. There's a stat out there that no individual defender held Durant below 50% shooting this year. So it's like, oh, well, they'll just try Iguodala if Barnes doesn't work, if Thompson doesn't work, if Livingston doesn't work. No, there just hasn't been anyone that's slowed him down. And that may be because that person doesn't exist. But, you know, if Durant is allowed by Westbrook, frankly, to get the number of shots that he needs, that he should get, I mean, we could see him average 40. It wouldn't surprise me. So that's a problem that just may not have a solution on the Warriors end. They just may have to weather that.
Yeah, so going into this series, it seems like there's a few predictable games. There's, you know, the Draymond game where he has a wild triple-double and seems like he's pulling the Warriors out of a game they shouldn't win, and they win. There's the game where Russ goes for 35, 10, and 11, and he wins it for him. There's the game, or maybe multiple games, where Durant goes off. And then there's the Curry games. So it seems like this game's going to go at least... It's going to go at least 6. Is there a chance, and you highlighted this in your piece, that, you know, obviously KD has been amazing against the Warriors this year, but is there a chance that KD can be the best player in a 7-game series and win it for the Thunder just based off of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, absolutely there is. You know, he's a top 5 player in the league. He might have been the second or third. So to me, this is kind of a tangent, but as great as Westbrook was this year, and a lot of the statistics will say he was better than Durant, I think Durant is still the better player. Mainly because he doesn't take things off the table the way Westbrook does. Durant doesn't lose you games. I think Westbrook has lost his team some games. He's won a lot more of them. But Durant is absolutely good enough to win this series. You know, for that matter, Westbrook's good enough. Klay Thompson might win this series. I don't know. It's just that's the level of talent that's in. You know, we've got all 3 of the last 3 MVPs. We've got a whole bunch of all NBA first teamers. We got a bunch of all stars. We got a bunch of all defense. The talent, the top end talent in this series is, I think you can make a case, about as good as we've seen, you know, in the last, you name it, like couple decades. It's that good. So Durant definitely could do it, but he's not alone. And I think, like you said, there's going to be the Curry game and the Westbrook game. So kind of depends on which of those happens the most, really. And it will be a long series, I think, for that reason.
The point about KD and Westbrook is I'm so glad you made that point, because like you said, Westbrook can take some things off the table for his team. And in that Spurs series, like the last 3 games, more so the last 2, it felt like a game, both of them, that Russ was just going to screw up for his team. And like you said, he's an amazing player. Stats show it. The eye test shows it. He's so fast. He's so powerful. And when he wants to be, he can make great decisions. The problem is that he's an awful 3-point shooter, one of the worst in NBA history. He can be turnover prone. And you just get these feelings that, like, I feel like him and Durant are buds, and they're totally in it together and they get it. But I feel like as soon as Durant misses a shot or two, in the past, it seemed like Russ just is like, all right, well, F it, I'm going to go off now. And his version of going off is, sometimes it's great. Sometimes he makes smart plays. He gets to the bucket. His jumper's going. But other times it's pulling up from 30 feet. And for some reason, in 2 straight games, he was actually able to do all those things. And he was able to take the ball away from Durant in some circumstances, and he didn't completely screw it up. So be honest, were you expecting Russ just to completely like crap the bed, for lack of a better term, in those last 2 games and just give the series to the Spurs?
Well, here's the thing. You mentioned you talk about predictable narratives. So Westbrook has this arc that happens like over the course of weeks or seasons or playoff series. And that is, he is a crazy person, and in a good way, because he's a competitive lunatic. And he'll just go totally overboard. And, triple doubles left and right, 40-point games, he gets to the free throw line 15 times, all this stuff. And then, that'll cross that line wherever it is, and he'll screw it up, like you said. And then we all get all over him. But then the backlash to that is, well, he's so great, blah, blah, blah. And then he'll have those games where, he took like 11 shots and he had 15 assists. And it's like the subdued Westbrook game. And he kind of goes that way for a while. And then it picks back up and he goes nuts again. That criticism happened at the beginning of the Spurs series because he was screwing up. And there was even some of that in the Mavericks series for his defense. He let Raymond Felton score baskets in an NBA game. So you can't do that. And so that's sort of the narrative is played out already, right? Like, so he did his crazy stuff. We criticized him. He calmed down and he was great. And how long he can sort of hold that equilibrium is always the question. But if it's true that, he's kind of in that sweet spot now, that's a problem for the Warriors, because good Westbrook allows, great Durant to be a thing. If you get crazy Westbrook again and he costs them a game or two, that, time and sort of recovery back to a more balanced Westbrook, the Thunder may not have that luxury against a team as good as the Warriors.
You talked about Westbrook's his peaks and his valleys there. So what's your biggest fear from a Warriors perspective? Like the one that Kerr and Draymond and Steph, I don't think Draymond gets scared of anything, but the one that Kerr wakes up in the middle of the night in a cold sweat and he's just like, crap, that could happen.
It's just the Thunder's talent overwhelming the Warriors, which is just Durant and Westbrook. If those two guys are at A+ for 5 games in this series, the Thunder might just win 4 of them. And it's crazy to say that there's a potential for the Warriors to lose a series based on sheer talent, because the Warriors have like more of it top to bottom than anybody in a really long time. But this has always been the idea, or sort of the thing that was so intriguing about the Thunder. And injuries got in the way in the past, and Westbrook got in the way in the past, and maybe inexperience. But there's this thought that if those two guys play as well as they possibly can, you can't compete with that. So, and that's exactly the kind of thing you should wake up concerned about, because it's kind of one of those, well, we can't do anything about this if you're Steve Kerr. There is no stopping like dominant athleticism if of the kind the Thunder have, if those two guys are playing as well as they possibly can. I don't know how likely that is, but that's what would worry me the most, for sure.
Reverse the question. What's your biggest fear from a Thunder perspective?
That this defense is a mirage, and that the big lineups that worked against the Spurs won't against the Warriors. And to me, that's kind of how I see that being the more likely scenario. The Spurs were, it turns out, like a really good matchup for the Thunder. And the Warriors are a good matchup for no one. So I think that if I'm the Thunder, I'm concerned, although I'm sure they would, they're not worried about this, I don't think, in any real way. I think their confidence is through the roof. But I'd be worried that we can't do the same things and win. It's just not going to work.
So moving on to predictions, mine real quick is, and I guess this is more so a hopeful one than what could actually happen, and that's Warriors in 7. But I think there's a scenario. There's obviously the scenario where Russ and KD are both A++, and the Thunder can win the series. But the scenario that seems like it could very well happen, because just bad things just seem to happen to the Thunder, is that, like you said, the big man lineup with Adams and Cantor doesn't work, and the coaching genius that we thought, Billy Donovan, doesn't realize it and stumbled into it in the Spurs series. And like you said, great matchup, and he happened just to play it more because Ibaka wasn't playing well, which he wasn't, and stumbled into this great matchup against the Spurs, and all of a sudden Adams and Kanter are playing great together, and all of a sudden, the media is heralding, Billy Donovan outcoached Greg Popovich, which, like, there are multiple things that he did, but there's also the scenario where Billy Donovan thinks that this is just going to work, and he wakes up in game 5 and they're down 3-1, and he's still trying the Adams Kanter thing even though it's not working, and they're getting dominated, and all of a sudden they're out in 5 games. So I think that's a very, I see that scenario happening more likely than I see the one where the Thunder actually win. But my prediction is Warriors in 7, just because more so that I'm hoping for it. How about you?
Yeah, I said Warriors in 6, and I realize that means that Golden State closes it out on the road, which is always like a really weird way to go and seems highly unlikely. And that was just because, like, I felt like saying 5 was shortchanging the Thunder, even though I think, it's probably true that we're a little bit over the moon about the Thunder after everything kind of went right. So 5 seemed too few. 7 seemed like too many, just because I thought, I just think the Warriors are the superior team. I mean, in situations like this, for a lot of the reasons you talked about, there's a recency bias. There's, overreacting to the matchup thing. And if you just kind of step back and like try to get, a little perspective, the Warriors won 73 games. They have the best player on the planet. They beat the Thunder every time they played them this year, even if you want to put asterisks on all 3 of those games. Like, I think the macro view just, to me, suggests that the Warriors don't need to go the distance to beat this team. So I said 6. I don't know. The prediction game to me is always tough. But like, I'm kind of with you too, that if the series is a short one, it'll be because the Warriors just blow the doors off. I don't see any realistic scenario where, the Thunder can do it in 5 or let alone sweep or anything crazy like that.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. And I think 7 for me was more so just like, I'm really hoping this series is going to live up to all the hype. And Lord knows that, gosh, an NBA playoff series that, we have hoped that would be amazing, half of them turns out just to be blowouts. And there's the scenario where you're right. This team won 73 freaking games in the regular season and had the player who had one of the greatest single seasons in NBA history. And there's a very realistic chance they just blow the doors off of the Thunder. Westbrook self-combusts, Donovan self-combusts, and this series is over in 5. So that could definitely happen. Over in the East, not really that interesting. And I think it's been interesting. So many people, and rightly so. I mean, like, it's the Cavs 3-point shot making ability or increase or whatever it was, where they've hit these ridiculous amount of threes in games, has been covered because the 3-point shot is the sexy thing, and if you can do it well, then all of a sudden, you can compete with the Warriors. Doesn't it seem like this whole, and maybe the Love at 5 thing could actually compete with the Warriors? I don't think it can, but this narrative of the Cavs' increased 3-point shot, just moving over to the East, assuming, we're jinxing the Warriors here, assuming they get to the finals, they'll likely meet the Cavs. Is this whole increased 3-point thing just playing right into the Warriors' hands of, sure, let J.R. Smith take 6 threes in a game. Sure, Kyrie, you can have 5 or 6 threes today. LeBron, you want to take a few of them? Be my guest. Is this increased 3-point shot just playing into the Warriors' hands?
I think sort of as a broader idea, I like the idea of a team that is inferior, and like, I don't mean that, inferior is a pejorative term, but everyone is inferior to the Warriors. So if you're playing the Warriors, I like the idea of taking a lot of high variance shots, which is basically threes, just because maybe you steal a game or 2 because you're hot, and it's just easier to get hot, or, to sort of do something unexpected or win a game that you shouldn't, if you're taking these sort of higher risk, higher reward plays. So like, just from a macro kind of perspective, that's a good idea. I think it is dangerous because, like, anecdotally, you shouldn't try to beat the Warriors at what the Warriors want to do. Like, you should try to mess things up or go big or make them uncomfortable somehow. So that's risky. To me, the bigger thing that it needs to be discussed with the Cavs, playing a little smaller and shooting more threes, is that if they're going to put Kevin Love on the floor, which they do in these lineups, or Channing Frye at center, the Warriors are going to just eat that up on the other end. Kevin Love, especially if Kyrie Irving is on the floor, like there is, to my eye, hardly a worse pick and roll defensive combination in the league than Irving and Love. And the Warriors just kill everybody on pick and roll anyway with Curry and Draymond. So if you want to let those guys, play a whole bunch of defensive possessions because they help you shoot a lot of threes, good luck, because you're going to have to be really, really hot. You're going to have to make 25 threes in a game to sort of compensate for all that you're giving up on the other end. And we didn't see that last year because Love and Irving were hurt in the finals. And I think this narrative that those guys would have given Cleveland a better shot against Golden State, I think we should be a little bit careful about falling in love with that idea.
At the same time, though, doesn't it feel like the only way, and I guess I'm playing a little bit of devil's advocate here, you talked about getting hot and that, that's maybe the smart thing to do against the Warriors, or obviously getting hot is the smart thing to do, but, shooting a lot of threes is perhaps the smart thing to do against the Warriors. So you think there's a likelier scenario of the Cavs beating the Warriors, and I could be just totally taking the words out of your mouth, so definitely correct me here, but you feel that there's a better chance that the Cavs could beat the Warriors shooting threes than playing big like they did last year?
Yeah, and it's not, I wouldn't say that about every team. The Cavs, I think, they're unique in that they have a lot of guys that can shoot threes. And their front line, I think Mozgov is basically unplayable at this point. He was better last year. He had off-season surgery, and he's just never been the same. So going bigger for Cleveland specifically is really not a great option. So, yeah, to me, having them, if they want the best chance to win, and admittedly, like we discussed, this is playing into the Warriors' hands to some extent, but going big isn't a great option for Cleveland just because of their personnel. Shooting threes is also because of their personnel. So it's kind of a specific argument in that case. But I think because the Cavs, hypothetically could make 23s, a couple of games in the series, that's probably the best way to go. It's certainly not without its risks.
Yeah, I just want to hit a few quick NBA general topics real quick. We like to consider ourselves smart, sophisticated NBA fans, but there is the salacious side to the NBA in terms of the TMZ of, who's leaving and going where. And just be honest with me. You kind of want LeBron to leave Cleveland if things go bad, don't you?
I think about that a lot. I've thought for a long time that he had painted himself into such a corner with the whole "I'm back" the Sports Illustrated letter, making it about the city and not the team and all this other stuff. So even if anything, because he went that route, and because it would be so just crazily absurd for him to leave again, I kind of would like to see that just because it seems so unfathomable given this grand commitment that he made. And I would say those guys still don't look like they have a lot of fun together all the time. So it's not totally out of the question to me.
And I think I've used this analogy before, but it really feels like some kind of weird marriage. Like LeBron grew up with Cleveland. Cleveland was this great partner. They were friends. He came out of college or whatever. He graduated with an MBA. They're moving to the city. They're going to have a really successful family. And after 7 or 8 years, he realizes that he's really putting forward the effort into it. So he thinks, okay, let's just call it quits. We had our fun together, but we couldn't make it work. So it goes down to Miami. He's dating the 20-year-old, and he wins his championships, decides, all right, let's make this work for the kids. He comes back to Cleveland, and Cleveland's gotten their hair done. They've put on some makeup, but it's all superficial stuff. And it's still not working. So to be honest, and granted, LeBron's been kind of he's been a pain in the butt this year to some extent, and I'm a pretty big LeBron fan. I've always supported him, but he's kind of been for lack of a better term, a turd this year. He really has. So I wouldn't blame him if he left again. And like you said, it would be such a funny spectacle that I kind of hope it happens. And I hope he goes back to Miami and tries to make it work again with, a weird Dwayne Wade resurgence and a team that it's kind of ironic. LeBron went to Cleveland to escape the age in Miami, and Miami got, lucky with Hassan Whiteside, and they picked up a point guard partially because LeBron left, so maybe they don't get Dragic. But it's kind of funny seeing how it's all come full circle, and now Cleveland's looking a little old and a little outdated, and Miami's actually the team where it's like Wade's like this cool hip old guy now who's actually like has a really good old man game and is surrounded by young talent. And so I think you're right. LeBron painted himself into a corner, and it's kind of funny to watch it happen, isn't it?
No, it is. I'll tell you what, though, we don't need to dwell on this, but who has come out of this whole thing better than Dwayne Wade? I mean, he will basically get to do whatever he wants forever in perpetuity in Miami because he stayed, because he's still awesome, because he's just he has played every single note of this whole thing right from start to finish, pre-LeBron, during LeBron, post-LeBron. He has come out of this looking so good, and his legacy, I think, is going to be, just spotless. And it's so rare to see a guy, he's going to stay there his whole career, I think, unless him and LeBron have something else worked out, like they're going to go to Philadelphia or something. But he is really, I've loved every second of the way that he has played and kind of conducted this whole thing since LeBron left.
What a legacy, because he really is going to go down as one of the most liked and appreciated NBA players of all time, because he was seduced by the Chicago thing. He stayed the course, him and Riley, the system. When LeBron came, he took the back seat. He wasn't a baby about it. And they won championships. He handled Shaq, and then LeBron left. He handled the whole thing gracefully, and now he's ushering in this new system in Miami with Whiteside and Winslow and Dragic, and he's just so likable, and it's really cool to see. And real quick, speaking of unlikable, the Clippers flamed out again, and it just as soon as we thought things were breaking for them, Chris Paul, breaks his hand and Griffin goes out. Do you keep it together because they can consistently win 50 games, or do you blow it up?
Well, it's weirdly in the similar position as last year when it was clear that their bench was the problem, or whatever. Maybe they don't like each other, blah blah blah. To me, blowing it up is risky because they have so many guys like Griffin, particularly. His value is never. I mean, it's hard to see how his value could be lower than it is right now. So just in terms of the timing, blowing it up is really dangerous. And I do think that if they keep it together, they're never going to win a title with this group. I just think that opportunity has passed. But if you're going to blow it up, I think you've waited a little too long, and you might need to wait longer so some of these guys can sort of, get their value back up to where it makes sense, where you can get something back you can really build around if you do trade Griffin.
Yeah, it stinks because I really thought that with the additions of Josh Smith and Lance Stevenson, and now that those words are immediately realizing how, wow, I cannot believe I was seduced by that. Thinking, now they're going to have a solid bench, Josh Smith and Lance Stevenson. And I've completely obliterated the point I was going to make by merely suggesting that Josh Smith and Lance Stevenson were going to be the start to a bench that could actually be sustainable in the regular season and the playoffs. So it serves me right for thinking that would work. What about the Houston Rockets?
Boy, that's going to be tough. I think, the Dwight Howard, I assume he's going to be gone. He's got an opt-out clause. I think probably if, the Rockets at this point, I think because of what it would cost to retain him, are probably going to be happy that he's gone. He's not at a point where he's a guy where he deserves max money just for his production and all the other nonsense that kind of comes with the Dwight Howard package. So he can go be somebody else's problem, which frees up money, and Houston could go spend on somebody else. To me, the underlying issue is Harden. And I just don't know. It's tough. It's kind of a Carmelo Anthony thing. If you're around Golden State for the Monte Ellis years, to a lesser extent, it's kind of that situation where you've got a guy that needs to be the best player on your team. Like there's no scenario where he cannot be the alpha, as overused as that term is. And you're stuck with that. The problem is if he is the best player on your team, you're always going to have these weird, effort issues and commitment issues and, sort of a fractured locker room because this guy, conducts business in like he's special, which, he is, he's really great. But I think it puts a ceiling on that team. And I don't know the personnel combination that can overcome the things that Harden does to sort of put that cap on. So that's the bigger issue to me. I don't know what they do. I don't know how they kind of make this functional. It's going to be a real challenge, but they'll have some money, I think, if Howard leaves to sort of figure that out.
I don't know why I put the Rockets and the Clippers at the end of this, so I want to end on a positive note as opposed to two dysfunctional teams. Just real quick, how fun has it been to be around the Warriors the past couple of years?
It's been surreal, and that's a total cop-out answer. But it is like, I'll fully admit, I've been a Warriors fan my entire life. I was there for just like the horrible years, 2 decades really worth of it, where they were dysfunctional. Like the ownership was a joke. They just had no idea how to put together a team, and it was awful. And this just feels, that historical greatness is the status quo now is really indescribable. And it doesn't feel real. And I don't know that it ever will. But it's been incredible. I don't think I could have ever envisioned a scenario where the Warriors were, really the best team in sports. And it's going to take I don't know how long it's going to take for me to put it in perspective. But it's been incredible. And if they win another title after a 73-win season, I may just have to stop following them because I don't know how it could possibly get better.
It is much better to end talking about the Warriors than it is talking about the Clippers or the Rockets. So we will end there. Grant, thank you for joining us. You can check Grant out at GT_Hughes. Be sure to give him a follow on Twitter so you can get up-to-date content from him whenever he writes new stuff for Bleacher Report. His recent stuff has been really good as usual, really informative and entertaining to read. So be sure to check that stuff out over at Bleacher Report and Grant on Twitter. You can check us out on unprofession.com, at unprofession on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, just to keep up with our latest pieces, and also subscribe on iTunes or SoundCloud, whichever you listen to your podcasts on. But Nathan Page is coming out with a piece in the next couple days on, actually it could be already up by the time this podcast is posted, but it should be out before the Warriors and Thunder series, so be sure to check that out. I've written some stuff recently, varied on some entertainment stuff, Daredevil and House of Cards, as well as some political stuff, because even as a sports fan, I cannot get enough of this political race in the United States presidency position. So be sure to check all that out at unprofession.com. And Grant, thank you for joining us. It has been an honor, and we will look forward to your future content. And the NBA Finals are almost here. So thanks for joining us, man.
Yep, getting close. Thanks for having me.